Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of December of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kherson direction. Before we start, another important note. Another day without even a single geolocated Russian FAB strike. I'm not saying that the Russians are not bombing this area, but during the active period of clashes in this area, during the 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Russians were publishing every single day for 10, 20, 15, 5, 6 geolocated FAB strikes, and now we don't have anything. The Russians were bombing, just to remind you, Berislav, Kazatska, Burgunka, Lvova, Tyaginka, Tokarivka, Mykolaiska, Antonovka. The Russians were bombing the villages and cities like Zmiyevka, and many other areas were under very heavy bombardments, and now the Russians are not bombing anything. And as we discussed, according to information we have, this is the main reason why the Russians are not bombing is that the Ukrainians recently have redeployed Patriot system on the South Kherson direction, and as a result of Patriot system work, the Russians lost up to 5 aircrafts. This information wasn't confirmed by the Russian sources. This might be just a speculation. The only important thing that all these things are correlated. And today we got more details from the Russian sources on the ground, from the Russian sources who confirms, from the Russian source who confirms that there was a case with 5 aircraft from the Russian side. And according to him, yesterday the Ukrainians were planning to make a special operation, and they created a legend for that operation. And according to Russian sources, the Ukrainians were planning to evacuate the Patriot system from Kherson direction. And for these purposes, the Ukrainians were using the railway station in Kherson itself. And if you remember, if you follow the situation in Ukraine, Zelensky yesterday officially reported about a very heavy strike with Iskander in Kherson. There were around 5 or something like these strikes in the city. And as a result of those strikes, according to Zelensky, there were losses among civilians, that the Russians were bombing, let's say, the civilian infrastructure and so on. But according to unofficial sources, Russian, the Ukrainians, yes, they were planning to evacuate Patriot system and the officers and the guard of this system. When talking about the Patriot system, according to the Russians, there was around 60 officers, 60, let's say, pilots, not pilots, 16 operators, and 4 of them is the ex-soldiers of United Kingdom forces. And when the Ukrainians concentrated their forces on the railway station somewhere in Kherson, the Russians attacked this territory, and up to 45 soldiers of Ukrainian army, of Ukrainian soldiers, were killed. This is very important information, because if it's true, if the Russians manage to break their evacuation of the Patriot system, that means that the Ukrainians are no longer able to use this system in Kherson direction, and that means that the Russians are going to restart the use of FABs in this area very soon. So we'll follow the situation. Now we are moving to Krynky itself. We have lots of, as you can see, geolocations from this territory. During the previous night and the previous 24 hours, the Russians made lots of attempts to attack this village from different directions. The Russians, as a result of offensive operation on the southwest of Krynky, managed to enter the Ukrainian-controlled territory somewhere in this direction, managed to dig in deeper and to create a fire position, a small stronghold. During the day, the Ukrainians were flying above this territory with FPV drones. They were hunting the Russians, trying to get them and to destroy them as a result of FPV drone strikes. On this video, we can see one of those episodes. Further, later we got more details about the Russian offensive operation, another episode of Russian storming operation of Krynky. We got the video also from the Ukrainian side, how the Russian wounded soldiers were trying to how the Russians were trying to evacuate the Russian wounded soldiers. On this video, for example, we see evacuation team. One team is coming, another team is evacuating. So there was a very heavy clashes, and the Russian evacuation team was moving something like this around this street in direction of Kazachye, of the village by the name of Kazachye Lahiri. So from the southern part, the Russians were attacking, and the wounded soldiers were evacuated to this evacuation zone, and from this evacuation zone, the Russians were trying to evacuate their wounded soldiers. So this is the operation and details of the operation that took place on the southwestern part of Krynky. On the northern part of Krynky, the Russians tried to make another attack, and this very interesting area. As you can see, there are a lot of geolocations, lots of icons of Ukraine FPV drone strikes. If we open one of them, we're gonna see how the Russians were trying to storm Krynky from the south, from the forest area, using personnel armored carriers and some number of infantry and just stormtroopers. The Russians, as you can see, landed in this area. They got the defense positions and they were expecting for some reinforcement. And while the Russians were waiting and expecting for reinforcements, the Ukrainians started bombing and attacking them with FPV drones. So the Russians, according to information we have, entered this territory somewhere from the south. They got this area on the armored vehicles. On this area, they tried to dig in deeper and to create a small foothold for further offensive operation. And after that, the Russians started moving in different directions, furthermore, basically to the north in direction of the Dnipro, not of the Dnipro, but Kazachyi-Lagerska-Konka river. So that was the Russian operation on this direction. Furthermore, this morning, with the previous update, we have already discussed another Russian offensive operation that took place along the Dnipro river, and the Russians were moving something like this, clearing every single building in this area. They were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions, and we also have a geolocated video. When talking about this territory, this video and all these events are very interesting because according to this configuration of the map and according to most of the mappers you can find, including pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, neutral mappers, you're gonna find that this territory where the Russians were clearing and attacking was or is under Russian control. So this area, I have the most questions about this territory. How did that happen? So the Russians were forced to clear this territory for the second or even for the third time. And once again, according to my understanding, according to my conclusions I made, the Russians, because of the fact that they are no longer able to use FAPs in this area, were forced to use like different methods of clearing, like Lancet strikes, artillery forces, and because of absence of FAP 500, the Ukrainians renewed their, let's say, landing operation, and they start sending more and more infantry because they now know that they can hold this territory longer and there are no risk from the Russian side to be attacked with FAP 500. And this is the reason why the Russians were forced to clear this territory once again. Now we are moving to Zaporizhia area, where we got also significant number of updates from Rabotina. We got, as you can see, a lot of geolocations from every single side. As we discussed in the previous videos, currently the Russians are trying to develop their offensive operation to the base of Rabotina, to the entrance to the city. And the latest geolocations we received confirms that the Russians have already established fire control over the main entrance to the village. The Ukrainians lost control over this territory. They are no longer able to use this road 05, not 05 but 04, 05, this road for supporting and supplying their forces in the village, because the Russians established complete control. The only safe road they have is a little bit to the northeast from Rabotina, something like this. This is the only safe road the Ukrainians currently have. They need to make a hook, and also they will have to return back to the same road, but now they need to make a hook. This is like the some difficulties in their logistic. Furthermore, today we got another geolocated confirmation of another Russian attack from the south in direction of the fields between Rabotina and Verbova. And as a result of that attack, we have geolocated video. We will not watch this video due to the losses and dead bodies and violence between Russian and Ukrainian army, but according to this geolocation, the Russians at least managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and to develop their offensive operation to the north and basically to split this territory in two parts. There are very high chances that the Russians managed to capture more territories, more trenches and fortifications, but we are updating map just according to geolocation we have. And if we increase the number of updates, let's say since the beginning of December, we're gonna see that the Russians were attacking not in this direction. As you can see, we have some attacks a little bit to the west and further to the west and so on. And the most important thing that the Russians during the December were trying to attack not just to the west north of Rabotina, not just from the south, but also the Russians, if you remember, were attacking and made lots of attempts to attack on the north west of Verbova. So that those attacks also took place in December, and now we can see the entire and full picture of the battle for Rabotina cake. The Russians are moving their global directions, let's say This is the first global direction. This is the second Russian global direction from the south, and this is the third Russian global direction. Basically, they're attacking the Ukrainians in this area from three places, and the main purpose of the Russians is to split this territory at least in two big pieces of cake. This is the first one, Rabotina, and this is the second one, the trenches on the west from Verbova. And as soon as they're able to cut this territory, they will handle with every single piece side one by one. So this is the not even the beginning, this probably is the middle part of the battle for Rabotina, and I expect within the next maybe 72 hours the beginning of clashes in the village itself, Rabotina village itself. Now we are moving to the south, the nearest direction. We also have a lot of updates from this territory. As we discussed, according to information we have, the Russians in front of Russian army, there are few checkpoints and very powerful strongholds in front of the Russian army. This is the second one, as we discussed. This is a very powerful fortification area that located on the hill. This is the second fortification army right in front of Russian on the way of the Russians between Marinka and Novomykhailivka. This is the third fortification area, and there is fourth fortification area that still remains under Ukraine control. During the previous clashes, during the previous fightings in Novomykhailivka area, the Russians managed to establish control over a few fortification areas as well, mainly on the south and southeast direction. This is the first fortification area the Russians managed to capture, and these are, let's say, the second fortification area the Russians managed to capture as well. So based on these geolocations, we can say that there is a breakthrough on the south and southeast of Novomykhailivka, and probably on the east as well. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians were bombing this territory heavily using the regular and the usual types of weapon like towed flamethrower systems. The Russians were using FAB 1500 and FAB 1500. As you can see, there are no problems with air defense, so that's why the Russians publish video from Novomykhailivka every single day. And once again, as soon as we start talking about the problems with air defense in Kherson, the Russians stop publishing any videos with FABs at all. Anyway, something is happening there. But let's return back to Novomykhailivka. And today probably we got one of the most important videos from this direction. The first one we have already discussed, the Russian tank attack between these two fortifications area in Pobeda and along the tree lines. And the main purpose and the main Russian goal is to bypass the fields and to dig in deeper between these two fortifications area, and then from, let's say, this foothold, from these tree lines and trenches, the Russians would try to encircle and to cut Pobeda from the southeast, and they will try to encircle and bypass the main fortifications areas on the north of Novomykhailivka from the northwest. So this is the plan of the Russians on the northern direction. And today, right before I start making this video, we got another geolocated video of the beginning of the Russian ground operation inside of Novomykhailivka. On this video, we can see significant number of Russian armored vehicles, infantry who landed in the vicinity of these energy facilities. We see the smoke screen that the Russian tanks established for protection and defense purposes. And if you have like everything goes okay with your eyes, just pay attention to the southern part of the smoke screen. On these videos, on these scenes, very small points, very small shadows, we can see the movements of the Russian forces along this area. So this is it. This is the Russian soldier. Just a second. This is the black point. A Russian soldier lies right in front of the cursor. This is it. This is the first Russian troopers who entered Novomykhailivka from the east. So when talking about the southern part, the Russians entered cemetery and this, let's say, warehouse and these farms like a few days ago, maybe a week ago. But when talking about the territory of Novomykhailivka itself, the residential area. So just on the 27th of December, as a result of storm operation on the eastern side of the village, the Russians managed to to enter the village, and currently we can say that the real ground operation in the village started just today. Not today according to the real facts, but today according to the geolocation we received. So we can say for 90% sure that the Russians managed to establish their first foothold in the eastern part of Novomykhailivka, and the battle for village, real battle for village, has started. So we'll see what is going to be next, but once again, if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of December, we can see how the Russians were bombing this territory heavily. I'll remind you that the main purposes of these bombardments were to secure the roads and to demine and to clear the fields. We were talking about and discussing that a lot. All those bombardments and the total flamethrower strikes and so on. The Russians managed to create a safe road, and now they have entered the village. So there are very high chances, by the way, that before the Russian Orthodox Christmas they can take this village. Very high chances. So let's follow the situation as well. Now we are moving to the Avdiivka area. When talking about this territory, we haven't received nothing special. The same story, no progress on the ground on neither direction, neither on the south, west and north. Furthermore, when talking about the northern part, the Russians currently are not in offensive state, but are trying to hold this line and not to step back under the Ukrainian pressure. At least I have such expression when talking about geolocations we receive from this area. Probably the most important update from Donetsk and Avdiivka direction is that the Russians started using new type of multi-launch rocket system by the name of Возрождение. This is like universal multi-launch rocket system that can use every type of missiles. This system can attack and debomb the Ukrainian positions or enemy positions. It doesn't matter whether it's Ukrainians or not, with Grad systems, with TOS flamethrowers rounds, with Земледелие, distant mining method rounds, with different types of weapons. So it's universal and unique multi-launch rocket system that can use everything that can fly and attack. So this is probably the most important about the northern direction of Avdiivka and Donetsk. Now we are moving to Bakhmut Artyomov's direction. As you remember, we were talking a lot about the Russian progress in Bogdanovka and the Russian progress in the new cemetery in the vicinity of Popovsky Forest. We were talking a lot about the Russian progress in the area between Khromovo and Ivanovska, and most of the mappers have already updated their map showing the Russian progress. We, Military Summary Channel map, we haven't updated this map. We just shown this area as a gray zone because we try to stick to the geolocated facts. And just today, for example, when most of the mappers, including pro-Ukrainian like Deep State, have already updated this cemetery under Russian control, we just today got the first geolocated videos of the beginning of the Russian storm operation in this area. On this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with FPV drones. This video was geolocated, and according to this video we see that this event took place recently because of the fact that there are no snow. So there was snow, then the snow left, and now this is this period of time after the snow left this territory. I'm not saying that the Russians haven't established control over this cemetery, but just today, on the 27th of December, we start receiving the first updates of the Russian progress, and not just progress, of the Russian attempts to storm this territory. And the same story about the area between Khromovo and Bogdanovka. The Russians just today published the geolocated video how they were bombing with FPV drones the Ukrainian forces in these trenches, which just tell us that the beginning of the Russian offensive operation on this direction. So for now we will keep this territory as a gray zone, both these areas, because we need like a real confirmation of capturing of this territory for changing the color. When talking about Bogdanovka, as you can see, according to geolocations, the Russians using artillery forces are trying to cut every single road that Ukrainians use to support their forces on the hill. The Russians are bombing this territory 24 hours, 7 days a week with all types of weapons they have. And as you can see, this is like probably the 2 days or 3 days old video because of the snow on the surface. The Russians were bombing this territory heavily. And this is another video how the Russians cut and established complete complete fire control over these interceptions of the tree lines, using all types of artillery forces they have to bomb the Ukrainian machine gun position. So this area is already cut from the mainland. Now the Russians need to few more days, let's say, to force the Ukrainians to spend as many as possible ammo rounds on this hill, and after that, when the Ukrainian soldiers will be exhausted on the hill, the Russians can launch like ground operation and to establish complete control over this fortification area. For now, no progress on the ground, just distance clashes and nothing more. Now we are moving to another very important area, to Sporne, to Soledar direction. Very interesting geolocations and video we got on the 27th of December. We were talking just a few days ago that after the Russians managed to advance a little bit along the railways to the north in direction of Avdiivka, we discussed about the Russian clashes with the Ukrainians along these three lines, about the Russian attempts to attack in this direction. According to Ukrainians, all those attacks were repelled, at least to the south of Sporne. Maybe the Russians managed to advance along the railways, and we made like a projection that soon we need to expect another attempt to attack Sporne. And on the 27th of December, we start receiving first updates. This video was published by the Ukrainian side. And on this video, you can see how the Ukrainian FPV drone was attacking the concentration of Russian stormtroopers in Sporne. So this video was geolocated, these are Russian soldiers, and according to that geolocation, the Russians managed to get this territory, and they were trying to dig in deeper. Maybe they were waiting for other squads or platoons or groups that were moving from other direction. And of course, after a small operational pause, the Russians were planning to attack these farms, because this is more or less a normal, let's say, fortification area that the Russians can hold for developing of their further offensive operation. But we saw, according to the Ukrainian video, the Russians were attacked by the Ukrainian FPV drone. So this is the Russian progress on, let's say, central part of Sporne, and we will adjust the map and show this territory at least as a gray zone, but there are very high chances that the Russians captured this territory, and probably the Russians captured farms inside of Sporne. Furthermore, from the other side, from the northern side, the Russians made another attempt, another wave of attack in direction of the northern part of this village. The Ukrainians also published the video of FPV drone strikes against the Russian armored vehicles and infantry. As you can see on this, since we can calculate at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 armored vehicles, abandoned or damaged Russian armored vehicles. We see the footage of Ukrainians drones who were hunting the abandoned Russian troopers there. So this is like a small cemetery of armored vehicles. But all these geolocations tell us that the Russians were attacking Sporne from the south along this line, and also the Russians were trying to attack from the north. We can't tell for sure whether the Russians were successful or not. We need a few more days, and after that we're gonna understand how this battle for Sporne ended. Now we are moving to the north in direction of Lyman area. As you can see, we haven't received almost anything from this direction, just one geolocated video that we can use to confirm the positions of Ukrainian forces on this direction. So as a result of FPV drones, the strikes, the Ukrainians lost another tank, and this is the situation on Lyman. But as I understand, after the Russians managed to establish control over this tree line, currently they're trying to dig in deeper. They are taking a small operational pause, and obviously within just few next days they will renew their offensive operation. When talking about Kupiansk area, we have the same updates. There are very high chances, and according to some sources, the Ukrainians managed to force the Russians to step back from Sinkovka because of due to heavy losses and very difficult situation to control this area. Probably the Russians returned back to the forest between Lyman and Sinkovka for regrouping and for, let's say, to regroup and renew their forces, and then they will make another attempt to attack. But for now, as I understand, we can adjust this area and to color this territory as the area and the gray zone, or at least Ukrainian control. Also, the clashes renewed in the area between Ivanovka and Yagidne. On this video, for example, we can see another Russian attempt to attack against the Ukrainian positions. The Russians were bombing this territory, heavily attacking with tank. And this area is very interesting because, if you remember, For example, just for November and October, the Russians were storming this line maybe 3 or 4 times. But as I understand, every time the Russians captured this territory, after a few days they retreat, withdraw their positions. And this is like a perfect example of active defense. Active defense that Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, talks about almost every single day. First you attack and capture, clear, then you withdraw their position. Ukrainians get this territory once again, and when the Ukrainians are digging in deeper with infantry, the Russians counterattack once again. So this is the situation on Kupiansk area. Once again, the Russians have significant progress in Rabotino. The Russians started the ground operation in Novomykhailivka, in the village itself. The Russians made a very interesting attempt to attack in Sporna, and probably they managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt. And a very interesting situation is developing in Krynky, and I can't give you like 100% sure information what exactly is happening there. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.